Yes, hello. Thank you, Pete.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm very highly grateful to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk and for providing me this opportunity to hear and discuss the ideas regarding the evolution of space commercialization with you. My talk is on a work in progress, which is a part of a larger project that I have undertaken to examine the effect that space commercialization has on the concept of space power and as well as the future of the space club. Next slide, please. Okay, in this talk, I would like to refer to the origins of space commercialization in the aftermath of the Cold War from a governmental perspective and in the context of the dual-use nature of space technology. So first, I will contextualize the dual-use nature of space technology. I will then discuss the factors which together ignited a conceptual change regarding the dual use of space, and the outcome of which was greater commercialization. And third, I will demonstrate these factors through the example of the US experience in the early 90s, and especially in Desert Storm, which is often referred to as the first space war. Next slide, please. Okay. So the dual-use nature of space has two aspects. The first one, from a technological aspect, dual use refers to a technology that benefits both civilian and defense sectors. And in that sense, space technology is significantly affected by its potential to be used for civil activities in addition to military and defense activities. The second aspect I want to offer is for dual use can be also be perceived from a social or political aspect. So from this perspective, technology development and use are considered political practices, and therefore they serve as strategic assets. So from this perspective, national and international activities are perceived through the prism of the dual-use security dilemma, which is focused on the harmful, peaceful spectrum. And I would like to suggest a bit of a broader perspective, that is a balance between high risk and high gain to overall national considerations. So throughout the Cold War, the dual-use nature of space technology was considered a considerable challenge as well as a high risk. And therefore, it was mostly a state-only playground with only minor exceptions. So towards the end of the Cold War, this perception began to change. And I would like to point out three factors that when combined in the early 90s, they brought about a significant change in the perception of dual-use nature of space technology and shifting the focus from a significant threat and thus commercial activity being perceived as a high risk to commercial activity being a high gain. Next, please. Okay. So the momentum to encourage commercial space by US government began in the 1980s, but it was the change in the security environment in the early 90s, along with industrial technological maturity and new perceptions regarding space empowerment and the use of space technology to achieve national objectives that accelerated this trend. So because of these three factors, the dual-use heritage of space technologies being a high risk and the social mechanisms which developed to manage this risk were challenged and transformed. So national economic interests were better integrated into strategic thinking and policy making as the way to advance security considerations of empowerment and maintaining American leadership. So in the early 90s, this process reached a kind of a peak. The end of the Cold War resulted in a decrease in the overall national space budgets, and the conceptual outcome of the military success of Desert Storm was a greater reliance of US forces on space technologies, a conceptual change which was translated into a new doctrine, the Revolution in Military Affairs, or RMA, and the operational implementation of RMA demanded the acceleration of space development and force buildup. But government funding for that effort was limited. So the answer to this challenge was in the positive experience of using commercial space products and services in combat during desert storms. So the combination of these three factors triggered a shift in favor of dual-use activity in the context of public-private partnerships, and the dynamics which positively affected the expansion of commercial space activity in many fields. Next, please. Okay. So the end of the Cold War induced dramatic changes in the security environment of the international system. One conceptual outcome of the absence of a clear threat was the development of the concept of the end of history as we all know it. Next. Okay, so this graph of the US space budgets demonstrates the overall decrease in government space funding in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Next, please. Okay, this graph shows the US military space budget as part of the total US defense budget. It demonstrates not only the decrease in the funding for space, but an increase in the overall significance of space to military activities in the 19th and ever since. Please, the next one. Okay. I would like to talk briefly about Desert Storm. And just excuse me for the personal note, but this war has a lot to do with the fact that I became a space professional. At the time of the war, I was a teenager in Israel, and I recall that this was the first time that satellites and their use was brought to my attention in such a direct way, as I imagine to many others as well. Next slide, please. Okay. Space technology contributed a great deal to the coalition's military success. The U.S. military was able to use for the first time in combat the full array of civil, military, commercial, and intelligence satellites. The table presented in this slide is taken from a report to Congress. It shows a long list of defense, civil, commercial satellites and space systems that were used during the war. And therefore, the war demonstrated the importance of space as well as the potential of public-private partnerships. Next. Those positive military results reinforced the desire in the U.S. to try and recreate the conditions and pace of the Gulf War military actions in any future conflicts in which the Americans were required to use force. So 2 years later, in 1993, Vice President Dan Quayle submitted a report to the president in which he included lessons drawn from the conflict. He argued that the American superiority in the war was a direct consequence of its space capabilities, and therefore space constitutes a central component of America's strength as a superpower from a civilian and certainly from a military perspective. Next, please. In the report, he provided the logic for change regarding the dual-use nature of space technology in governmental American thinking. And so he states, the world has changed in many important respects. The Cold War has ended. We have had a revolution in electronic and other space-related technologies. The international demand for space capabilities has increased along with the proliferation of space technology to other nations. And Operation Desert Storm taught us many new lessons about the military use of space in combat. These and other factors present new opportunities and new challenges. Overall budget constraints and reduced defense spending have made it necessary more than ever before for the United States to ensure that it gets maximum return from its investments in space. Next. I want to say a few things about the RMA. As I said before, an important conceptual outcome of the war was the revolution in military affairs. It brought about a significant change in warfare and in how the American military uses space systems to support terrestrial military operations. RMA had 4 pillars, and space control was only one of these 4 pillars, but it was a very significant one because it is of great significance for mastering the other 3 pillars. So considering the decrease in national budgets, the high price of development, maintenance, and operation of space systems required new concepts of resources management and utilization. So the successful use of commercial space services in the Gulf War was a significant catalyst for policy changes in favor of public-private dual-use partnerships in space in order to fully realize the potential of RMA. Next. So as mentioned before, the momentum for greater commercialization began prior to the Gulf War, but was accelerated by it and by the conceptual transformations that it ignited. So the U.S. commercial space guidelines issued NSPD-3 in 91 were intended to promote the transfer of government-developed technology to the private sector and encourage agencies to participate in cooperative research and development programs with the private sector. Next. Next, please. Okay. So going back to the Vice President's report, these aspects regarding the value of partnerships with industry as well as with international partners continue to be of significance as highlighted in this section of the report. And this shift demanded further change in the U.S. security policies and regulations, which eventually we could see in the actual global space activity market. Next, please. So, in the absence of a clear enemy and during a period in which the U.S. as well as other governments had to face necessary budget cuts while in need to develop space capabilities, the model of public-private dual-use partnerships gained greater momentum in many fields of space activity in the U.S. as well as in other countries. And the conceptual change in the perception of the dual-use nature of space technology positively affected the space economy. So gradually, space activity expanded from a dual-use practice in a way, I would like to say, to a triple-use practice: defense, civil, and commercial. Next, please. So finally, at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that this is a part of a work in progress in which I look at other potential cases from the 90s. So here are a few other suggestions with which I will not go into, but just to keep in mind. Next and last. Okay. So to conclude, at present, the public space activities, whether for military or civil purposes, are intertwined with commercial space activity, and they contribute to the growth of the commercial space market and benefit from it. So further reinforcing the trend of dual-use cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. Nevertheless, in light of the rising security tensions and the international competition, a dual-use security dilemma may redevelop, but I will leave this for another talk. I would like to suggest the following 3 key takeaways. First, dual-use nature of space technology has shifted from a considerable challenge and a high risk to an opportunity with a high gain. Second, the U.S. maintains hard and soft power elements for synergies between government and non-government initiatives. And finally, leadership of and membership in the Future Space Club will depend on an innovative, scalable, and committed industrial base. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak before you today.